Alrighty, so we're going to go through the first 6 questions for 4.6. For the first one, we have x squared minus 4x minus 5 is greater than 0. So essentially what we're doing for each of these is solving and graphing. The first thing that you want to make sure when you're working with these inequalities is make sure that there is a 0 on one side, okay? So we need 0 on the right side, okay? Preferably the right hand side, okay? So that's step number 1. So once we have that 0, what we're going to do is put a box around the other stuff on the left hand side, okay? So this box on the left hand side is going to be our actual function. So I'm going to label this f of x, okay? So once we have created that box, what we then need to do is determine whether it is negative or positive. Negative or positive. So if we're looking at this, this says the box, or f of x, is greater than 0. So to be greater than 0, that means that you are what? Positive, right? So we know that this is going to be positive, okay? So when we're thinking about whether it's positive or negative, we think about f of x. F of x is a fancy way of saying what, x or y. Right, hopefully you guys said y. This is kind of like Dora the Explorer, where I hope you guys are answering the questions. Okay, but yeah, so essentially if we're looking at an xy plane, your x's are horizontal and your y's are up and down. So essentially everything above the x-axis is going to be positive and everything below the x-axis is going to be negative. So for us, we only want our answers to come from the top portion, okay? So now from here, once we've established whether it's negative or positive, we can change this inequality to an equal sign. So since we know it's positive, I'm just going to change it to an equal sign. And now we solve regularly. Because your x's are raised to different powers, that means we need to set it equal to 0. It is. And now we need to figure out how to factor this. So because our a is 1, we can regularly factor. We've talked about this before. And we want to know what adds to give us -4 and what multiplies to give us -5. So we want to know what adds to give us this number and multiplies to give this number, and we always take the sign, okay? If you don't know, you can make a multiplication chart with the multiplication number. So we have -5. So we have 1 and 5, and that would be it. One of them has to be negative because we have to multiply to get a negative, and it's always this sign in the middle is going to be the sign of the bigger one. So the negative has to go with the 5, and those do add to give us -4. So we have -1 and, +1 and -5. So now when we solve for this, we want to know what inside here would give us 0. So here, x is equal to -1 or x is equal to +5, okay? So this right here is only the answer if we were solving with an equal sign for an equation. But originally, we were told that this was an inequality where it's greater than. So what we're going to do, we can do this 2 different ways. We can either look at it graphically, or we can look at it on a xy plane, okay? So I'm going to do it graphically first. I think the graphing way, it's kind of like a shortcut. It doesn't work for all of them. Like for instance, if we're trying to do a trying to figure it out for a fraction, that's going to be a little bit more complicated. But if you're doing something simple that's just like a basic polynomial, you should be able to do it way 1, okay? So essentially, if we look at our function, our a is positive. And remember, when your a is positive, you are pointing up. So we have a minimum at the vertex. Y'all remember that? And when our a is negative, we are pointing down, so we have a max at the vertex. Okay, so since our a is +1, we are going to be pointing upward, okay? And essentially what we have found here are our critical values, and that is where it's going to cross the x-axis, okay? So we know when x is -1 and when x is +5, that's where our graph is crossing the x-axis. And we know that the shape looks like this, so we have a graph that looks like this, Okay, we're not so much concerned with how far this goes down or how tall it is. We're not asked to find the range. Essentially, we just want to know where our positive values are. So if we think about our positive, that's only going to be this arrow stopping at that 1 and this arrow over here, because this below the x-axis is going to be our negative, and we don't want that. We only want our positive value, okay? So now, if we read this from left to right, and we're focusing only on our x-axis, this goes from negative infinity to negative 1. So I'll write negative infinity to 1. And then we have 5 to infinity. Okay, remember our infinities always have parentheses, and then for us to be able to determine whether or not we use parentheses or brackets, we look back at our inequality from the original problem. So because there is not a line here, we are not including, which means we use parentheses, and then we separate that with a union. So this right here would be our final answer. Okay. As far as way 2 is concerned, I'm going to write way 2 down. I'll show you guys in 1 second. I'm going to rewrite my critical values, and then I'm going to rewrite the equation or the inequality real quick. Okay, so as far as way 2 goes, so if we were here, we have our critical values and we have our original inequality. What we're going to do is draw a number line and add our critical values on there. Okay, and then again, you know that it's crossing from here to here. You just need to figure out what is happening, whether this interval is positive, negative, this one's positive, negative, or this is positive or negative. And again, we know that we are looking for the positive values because this box right here, which is our f of x, is positive, okay? And it's positive because it says greater than 0. Alrighty, so what we're going to do is pick numbers in between each of these intervals. So let's do that. We have negative and a positive, so the easiest number here would probably be 0, right? Here I'll pick 6, and over here I'll pick negative 2, okay? Cool. So now what we do is we plug these into the box, okay? So plug into the box, okay? Remember, you can only have this box if there's a 0 on the other side. So if in the problem if the problem said less than like negative 2, you'd have to add that 2 to the other side and then draw your box, okay? So cool, we plug this into the box. If I do 0, the 0, 0, negative, so here we get a negative. If I do 6, that's 36, 6, 12, 24, minus, minus, so that's going to be a positive. We do negative 2. Negative 2 squared would give us 4, negative 6, negative. So we get a positive here, okay? So that's going to give us that's going to give us a positive 8, okay? So we get positive, negative, positive. One thing I like to point out, it's not always going to be alternating. It's not always going to be plus, minus, plus, minus. That just is going to happen on a lot of the problems that we work today, okay? So from here, we know that we only want the positive answers because we are working with our box being greater than 0. So I'm only going to write down this interval. So again, this goes all the way from negative infinity to negative 1. We use parentheses because of our inequality, and then we pick back up at 5, and then we go to infinity. So again, this would be our final answer. So whichever way you want to do it is completely fine.